In our exploration of watercolor techniques, the colors that I will be using are phthalo green and crimson. You do not need to use the exact same colors as me. However, it is a good idea to choose two complementary colors to ensure that you can clearly see the demonstrations that are presented here. The first technique is called wet on dry. Here we apply wet paint onto dry paper. To begin, dip your paintbrush in clean water. Once your brush is loaded with water, we can dip it in the pigment. A very dilute mix of it, like you can see. We apply this with our brush onto the dry paper surface and create precise strokes and details. Since the paper is dry, the paint tends to stay where it's applied, allowing for more precise lines and details. This technique is ideal for creating sharp edges, fine details, and controlled blending. It offers greater control over color intensity and layering compared to wet-on-wet techniques. It's essential to ensure that the paper is completely dry before starting, as moisture can cause unintended bleeding or blending. The lines can be softened and more color added using either clean water or pigmented water, as you see me do here. Our second technique is wet on wet. In this technique, we apply wet paint onto a wet surface of paper. To begin, coat your surface of the paper with clear water. Use a good amount of water while at the same time ensuring that you do not form any puddles on the surface, because this can give you undesirable blooms. Once the fibers of your paper are thoroughly absorbed in water, put some pigment, a very dilute mix of it, onto the wet surface. This method allows colors to blend and diffuse, creating soft, fluid transitions. Colors will merge and flow together, producing organic and unpredictable effects. The wet-on-wet technique is ideal for creating atmospheric effects and creating luminous washes. While the surface of the paper is still wet, a second color can be applied to create natural blends on the paper's surface. The watercolor dry-on-wet technique involves applying paint onto a wet paper surface. The paper is pre-wetted with clean water to create a fluid base. Paint is then added onto a wet surface, allowing it to blend and diffuse spontaneously. While loading paint onto the paintbrush, we ensure that our paintbrush is damp, which means that we dip it in water and then we dab it off on our towel to ensure that the excess water is taken off. We load onto our paintbrush a very thick concentration of the paint and we gradually apply this to the paper. Timing is crucial. Too wet of a surface can cause colors to bleed excessively, while too dry a surface might not allow for sufficient blending. This technique results in soft edges and gradual color transitions. You can manipulate the flow of pigment by tilting the paper or using brushes with varying levels of moisture. However, you have to ensure that the moisture on your brush is much less than the amount of water on your paper surface. The brush has to be relatively very dry, though not bone dry. The watercolor dry-on-dry technique involves applying paint to dry paper, creating distinct edges and textures. It requires minimal water on the brush to prevent excessive spread of colors. So I dab off my paintbrush on my towel to make sure that the excess water is taken off before I load it with a very thick concentration of the pigment. I decide then to spread the bristles of my brush to make sure that the effect is properly seen in my demonstration. So you can spread it like this and apply the colors which are relatively dry onto the dry surface of the paper to create very strong details. The relatively dry brush picks up the grainy texture of the cold pressed paper, and those are the details that we can see. This technique is also sometimes referred to as dry brushing. Watercolor graded wash technique involves smoothly transitioning colors from light to dark and vice versa. We begin by picking up pigments of one color and coat the top of the paper with this pigment till about halfway across the paper. Once we are halfway and the pigment is still wet, we pick up the second pigment and lay it down near the bottom of the paper. Because the paper was wet, the pigments mingle and mix in the middle region and give us a smooth transition that we can smoothen further by using our brush. This is the graded wash technique. This requires some practice to do, but with time, you will be better and better at this. That is it for part 1 of our techniques, and see you in the next lesson with 5 more techniques using watercolors.